Hey everyone, welcome back to this episode of Chapter 1, Part 2 on my new channel and podcast, It Girl in Crime, Murder, and Mystery, where I discuss in detail documentaries, film reenactments, and short content minis that encompass the topic of crime, murder, and or mystery in each chapter. And today's topic is crime. The film or content discussed will always be referenced and also linked in the description below. The referenced content can typically be seen or heard on easily accessible streaming services or social media platforms that inform us, the viewer, of catastrophic and unimaginable events that took place in our past. Now, before we dive into the details of this case, I implore you, if you have the want or the time, to watch this 3-part series, Murder Among the Mormons, on Netflix before starting this chapter with me. Now, before I continue on with the specifics of this documentary, Murder Among the Mormons, we must do a recap of last week's episode. But first, I would like to apologize for last week. I made a few mistakes when referring to this film, but most importantly, I messed up the title of this documentary. I kept saying Murder Amongst Mormons, when in all actuality, it's titled Murder Among the Mormons. Not sure how I messed that up, but I did, and wanted to take the time to hold myself accountable on that mix-up. Now, before I go on, hit that follow button and come along this journey with me. Let's begin. If you remember last week, we discussed the history of Salt Lake City, history of Mormon faith, and why they were important to talk about in this case. Stephen Fred Christensen and Kathy Sheets were the two victims of the 1985 Utah bombings that occurred within the same day of each other in Salt Lake. The few things they had in common were the city they lived in, their faith, and the tragic event that was bestowed upon them. Stephen, a financial advisor for the Mormon Church, and Kathy, the wife of another financial advisor, Gary Sheets, had one important factor in common that made them a target. And that was Mark Hofmann had his eyes on hurting them. The bombings happened on October 15, 1985. The police said that they were two booby-like bombs that exploded 3 hours apart from one another, killing Stephen, the financial advisor, outside his downtown office, and Kathy, who was the wife of Gary Sheets, Stephen's former business associate, at their suburban home. At first, Police Chief Bud Willoughby believed that the explosions may have been the work of a paid assassin, and by the next day, at least 8 bomb threats were received. Therefore, the police evacuated the homes and businesses belonging to people with connections to Stephen and his former business associate. From the police's statement, Stephen Fred Christensen, at 31 years old, had just arrived at his office in the Judge Building shortly after 8 a.m. when a box bearing his name and lying in a corridor exploded, killing him instantly. Concurrently, according to Sheriff Pete Hayward at Salt Lake County, at 11:21 a.m., Catherine Sheets, at 50 years of age, stepped out of her house, walked outside, and picked up a newspaper that was resting on a box, and the box exploded. The bomb at the home was originally thought to be intended for the victim's husband, J. Gary Sheets, a business consultant who once worked with Mr. Christensen. But spoiler, we do learn later on that the assumption was false and that Mark didn't really care who the bomb killed as long as it was effective. Chief Willoughby said originally investigators were pursuing 2 possible motives. One centers on the former business relationship between Mr. Christensen and Mr. Sheets, and the other on Mr. Christensen's procurement of a document implying that the founder of the Mormon Church used folk magic. The document was believed to have been written by Martin Harris, a close friend of Joseph Smith Jr.'s, the founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The document gives an account of Smith's efforts to obtain the gold plates from which he had translated the Book of Mormon. The account differs from official church histories, implying that Smith used folk magic in acquiring the plates. The document says an old spirit transfigured from a white salamander at first prevented Smith from obtaining the plates, which is why later the letters were named the Salamander Letters and also was purchased by Stephen Fred Christensen with the Mormon Church in mind. After seeing the crime scene photos of Stephen and Kathy, the pipe bombs were vicious. I'm going to use a little bit of discretion here as to not go overboard. I won't post those photos nor even give the link to where they could be found. When it was reported that they died instantly, they literally did. Those bombs ripped through their chests. Now, I'm not sure if the families decided not to do an autopsy because the cause of death was pretty obvious. I looked and could not find any public autopsy reports due to, in the state of Utah, copies of the autopsy reports are not public record. The Office of the Medical Examiner will provide copies of the autopsy report to the descendants' immediate family members or legal representative. Now came the discovery to who murdered them. On Wednesday, October 16, 1985, a third bomb rocked the city of Salt Lake. This time, the target was Mark Hofmann. The bomb exploded when he parked his car on the street, where others either heard or witnessed this explosion. From the news coverage at that time, you could tell the witnesses were stunned at what had happened. Mark Hofmann was rushed, of course, to the hospital immediately with presumably serious injuries. And this is where Hofmann kind of messed up. Due to this explosion in his car, the investigators and police had to obtain evidence of this terrorist attack. And what was in his car during this explosion? Well, tons of newly discovered Mormon documents that Mark had in his possession, called the McClellan Collection, which were rumored to concern the origins of the Mormon Church. After this bombing is when homicide prosecutor Gary Delia and chief investigator Michael George worked together in the discovery process of this investigation/case. With the collected evidence of Hofmann's car and the understanding that the Mormon Church tied the three victims together, they started their investigation. During the investigation, they learned that Mark was the person that sold Stephen Fred Christensen the White Salamander Letters that police originally thought could have been a motive in his attack. So they decided to dig a bit deeper into the background and investigation of Mark after that. They decided to look into the McClellan Collection and if the church was in negotiation to buy the documents from Hofmann. Gordon B. Hinckley, a high-ranking authority of the LDS Church, was the person that was in meetings with Hofmann for the documents. As reported by Al Rust, whom described himself as Hofmann's silent partner and the owner of Rust Coin and Gift Shop, the church had a long, trusted transactional relationship with Hofmann and is said to have acquired 40 documents from him. Hinckley represented the church in the meetings with Hofmann, and the church was reportedly offering $300,000 for some documents. When the investigators started questioning Hinckley and the church, Chief Investigator Michael George realized that the church started to hinder their investigation. One of the reasons to why the church acquires documents is because they don't want certain information that contradicts the church to come to life. And that is why they had so many dealings with Mark Hofmann and others to check the authenticity of the documents for themselves, and lastly, to decide if the documents should be buried or shared. Due to the original theory that Hofmann was a victim, the investigators believed maybe someone in the church hired an assassin for Hofmann over the McClellan Collection. Now, during the original suspect list, they weeded out friends and associates of the Mormon collector, seeing that all knew Mark and Stephen. Every one of them had to do multiple lie detector tests and a series of interviews by prosecutors and lead investigators. Though now we all in the true crime community know and comprehend that lie detector tests are completely unreliable, but at that time they were deemed as the main source of believability in 1985. One person was the lead suspect even before Mark was accused, and that was Shannon Flynn, the man I briefly discussed in part 1 that was Mark's closest friend. Now, Flynn in the documentary spoke of Mark in an intimate fashion. It felt like he was speaking about a lover or someone who had a deep connection with and was possibly in love with him. It was peculiar, to say the least, listening to Flynn explain away his involvement with Mark. But Flynn recalls a time when him and Hoffman went to New York City, and Flynn was aghast that Mark was letting his hair down and doing things that he would never have even thought to do back home in Salt Lake. In this retelling, Flynn allegedly sounds like a naive side chick that believed Mark only felt comfortable being himself around Flynn, until this trip when Flynn realized maybe what Mark said was a lie and he actually wasn't Mark's safe place, but a person Mark could manipulate. Like I said, watch the series because it's just so much to unpack with Shannon Flynn. As they dove into the background of Flynn, the news reported that the church never bought anything from Flynn and that Flynn was with Hoffman the night prior to Hoffman's bombing attack. But when questioned in this documentary about Flynn's time frame the night prior, he said ominously that his mind is running thin and that he can't really recall, but he maybe believes it was in the daytime and is not sure if it was a phone call or in person. Now, are y'all with me on this confusion? Now, if I don't get copyrighted by Netflix, I will put the clip in at this moment so you can see his body language and strange expressions. But I will dub my voice over his just to play the copyright game safe. I remember it specifically because it was my birthday, December 27th, 1983. Mark said, "Come here. I'm going to show you something that no one has seen." He takes out of his briefcase the salamander letter that was in the box where the gold plates were. What? What? Wow. And he says, "We don't have any photographs of this. Can you photograph it?" And so I was the first person to take those photographs. And he was keeping it under tremendous secrecy. I was one of a select group this big that was privy to the bombshells. Flynn was given a federal charge for possessing an unregistered firearm. I assume that happened because the authorities needed a reason to why a search warrant was needed, and suspicion wasn't good enough for the judge. While searching his home, they found incriminating evidence such as the Anarchist Cookbook, which details, among other things, how to make homemade bombs. Shocker, right? Now, this is my opinion, but when I found this information out, I believe allegedly that Shannon Flynn had to be involved in some way with the bombings, or that he knew extremely sensitive information about the bombings. With this new evidence, they tried to criminally charge Shannon Flynn with the fatal bombings of Stephen and Kathy, but it fell through the following week due to lack of evidence. Basically because Shannon Flynn didn't participate in the bombings, and so they couldn't prove that he did. With Flynn falling through, the prosecutor Gary Delia and chief investigator Michael George were back at square one. They luckily got a break because there was a witness from the Judge building, which was the location of the first bombing that struck Stephen Christensen. The witness informed the authorities that they saw a strange man lingering at the downtown Judge building. The witness described the man as clean-cut, and he wore a green high school letterman's jacket without the letter on it. The suspect had a package with brown wrapping paper around it, and on the left-hand corner was written, "To Stephen Christensen." Now, during the filming of Murder Among the Mormons, they decided to have Dory Hoffman, Mark's wife at that time, to be the voice of the household. And throughout part 2 of the documentary series, she continues to imply her innocence and cluelessness of not realizing the truth about her then husband, Mark Hoffman. Her saying that there was no real clues, or if she asked questions or inquired about a concern, he usually had an answer for it. I personally do believe her on that, honestly, in that she didn't press concerns upon Mark. She was and is a devout Mormon believer and a woman in that faith. At that time, women in that faith didn't have much authority. Therefore, they would get married and would concentrate on being good, obedient housewives of the time. So when we dissect Dory Hoffman's character, we must also remember the culture and era she was living in. Though I believe her in not pressing concerns, she was a housewife at that time, and she had kids with Mark as well. Kids get into every corner of the house, and if someone is preoccupied with looking after the household, they will eventually run into information, documents, receipts, or some type of weird, unexplainable conundrum that she may have ignored and didn't express to anyone, let alone her husband, Mark. For instance, the always locked room she was never allowed access to, aka the room Mark did all of his forgeries in. I think that she probably didn't see red flags, but definitely saw things that may have been evidence in hindsight. In the moment, she may have not known what she stumbled upon, but after everything about her husband came to light, do you think she is going to incriminate herself? Would you? Now, the reason the authorities stumbled in the direction of Mark Hoffman in the first place is because they got calls about the broadcasted witness's statement. The witness informed the police that Mark actually owned a similar letterman's jacket as described on the news. So they searched Hoffman's home hoping to find something that alludes to the making of bombs, and they didn't. But not surprisingly, they did find the green letterman's jacket from the witness's statement. After finding the jacket, they realized they had the suspect they have been looking for, but they didn't arrest him because they didn't have a motive of why he may have done the bombings. To be honest, I believe the authorities didn't arrest Hoffman the day they found the letterman's jacket in his home because they didn't want to step on the church's feet or toes. Because Mark was well connected to the church, because all of the documents he was finding for them, and also the LDS Church had unlimited resources in the state of Utah, and also there was no concrete evidence on Mark. So the only thing they could do was continue to confiscate more evidence and find the needle in the haystack. They originally learned they found nothing, they just had tons of nerdy Mormon documents that needed to be looked through. Mark was an expert forger and one of the best. He allegedly rediscovered the Oath of a Freeman while buying a few things in a bookstore in New York. The Oath of a Freeman was the first document printed in colonial America some 300 years ago, so it held major importance. There were plenty of reprints, but no one had ever had the original printed document on its original sheet of paper before. As I stated in part 1, a lot of the Mormons at that time were big history buffs and Mormon historians, and were very interested in the early settler days and their lost histories. It wasn't just about Mormon history per se, but they also cared about colonial history. After Hoffman rediscovered the Oath of a Freeman and he was ready to sell it, the main priority was checking for authenticity. And in the 80s, one of the few ways to do that is through a cyclotron test. The cyclotron test tests the ink and it uses high velocity protons that gives it an accurate analysis of paper and ink. Mark funded these tests in some of his expeditions by way of powerful men and sponsors that were interested in history. Mark, in every document, always had a partner that he would coerce to fund these tests, and in return, he would promise them a commission after he sold the verified documents. Now, since Mark was a master forger, of course, the Oath of a Freeman was cleared and authenticated to be real and true by the test. Crazy, right? During the investigation, they assumed that money was not a motive for Mark possibly bombing the two victims, because the Oath of a Freeman alone was reported to be in transit for sale for about $1.5 million in 1985. And Mark had multiple documents being sold and money continuously coming in at that time. And another blow to the investigation is Mark's attorney released his polygraph test results. He got a plus 14, which is the best result they'd ever seen in their careers. The detectives had to go back to the drawing board. Neighbors, friends, and business partners all believed Mark Hofmann was being falsely accused. And they just explained it away as he is someone maybe being framed because he was such a good, kind, and upstanding member of the Salt Lake City community. When looking throughout the evidence at the time, nothing looked out of the ordinary, nor interesting to authorities, honestly. After countless times of going over the evidence, they were going to give up until they decided to go over it one more time. With that, they found a piece of paper, an invoice, that had a business called Cox and Clark Engraving, whom were photo plate makers. And the invoice was written to a Mike Hansen, so their mission was to figure out who was Mike Hansen and the relation he had to Mark Hofmann. The investigators called the business and pretended to be Mike Hansen requesting a receipt for his taxes, which can I say would not fly today. Due to needing a search warrant for any information, rightfully so though, because personal information shouldn't be easy to get no matter the authority, right? Anyways, with the receipt they found, it was a plate for Deseret currency made up at these engravers. This was something Mark Hofmann and others like Shannon Flynn and Al West were dealing with, money items. Mark, as a kid and up until his arrest, definitely dealt with historical currency and money items. The investigators realized that he could have used resources at Cox and Clark Engraving to help him make forgeries. This turned the investigation completely around. They realized these documents, like the Salamander letters and the Oath of a Freeman, were forged. That would definitely be a motive for murder. Reporters announced that police were looking at a possible forgery ring as a motive for these bombings, and that turned the Mormon church and its leaders upside down. Now, was it solely Mark, or were others involved, such as the engraving company and others? Well, this is my personal opinion, but I definitely believe that people knew that Mark was forging items. Maybe a few in the community didn't know at first, but they definitely caught on and was receiving a cut from Mark as a payment for their silence. I mean, all of that money Mark had made couldn't have only gone to his household and selfish splurges. It also was aligned with hush money, allegedly, because there was no way a continuous, elaborate plan held on for so long without anyone finding out. To save face, the LDS Church then turned to the FBI and let them run their own authenticity tests on the Salamander letters of Martin Harris discussed earlier. Why they only sent the Salamander letters to the FBI and nothing else? Well, the letter was the main source of contention and questioned the origins and truthfulness of the church and its original creation. The whole faith is based on Joseph Smith Jr.'s accounts, and with the Salamander letters, what else about the church was a lie? The Salt Lake City chief investigator, not trusting the FBI, decided to go and get one of the best forensic document examiners in the world, George J. Throckmorton, for his investigative team. With George learning how the letters were originally authenticated and who authenticated them, he learned one of the people in charge of authentication at that time for the church was a man named Dean. And Dean was not a document examiner, but just a historian for BYU. Yes, that controversial religious university that's all over social media. And also that BYU that was named after Joseph Smith Jr.'s successor and the first governor of Utah, Brigham Young. Now, realizing the church chose a historian and not just doing what was done to the Oath of a Freeman document and doing a cyclotron test, that's when the document examiner George became suspicious. But since George Throckmorton is a Mormon, he wanted to be safe against his own biases and decided to have a second hand to help. And that brought in a non-Mormon forensic document examiner named William Flynn. With them still in detail researching and examining the Salamander documents, the report from the FBI came out. And the Federal Bureau of Investigations reported that the Salamander letters were genuine. That guys, they thought they were real. Examiners George and William were shocked and disagreed with the FBI on their findings, and that made them work even harder examining the letters. During the examination process, they had multiple documents of Mark, including the Salamander letters, and they noticed under a powerful microscope that the documents handled by Mark had this sort of cracked ink on them. So the investigators went back to the invoice from a Mike Hansen that was seized at Mark Hofmann's house to find this Mr. Hansen. Since they believed Mark to be a forger, they looked for other places where he could have made printing plates, which were Utah Engravings and DeBuzac Printing. At DeBuzac Printing, they brought a version of the Oath of Freeman and showed it to a worker there. And the worker reportedly said a Mike Hansen asked to have that made. Mike Hansen paid in cash but was short a few dollars this time and therefore had to pay the rest in personal checks. That personal check had Mark Hofmann's name on it. It's crazy that Mark Hofmann's other identity was discovered from a check written out for a few dollars. If only he had the full amount in cash. Now, in conclusion, the Oath of a Freeman and Salamander letters were complete forgeries. Not only that, the McClellan collection that was found scattered from the bombing of Mark's car were forgeries and never existed. Not only did the Oath of a Freeman pass the FBI's test, but they were going to place the document on the base of the Statue of Liberty in New York because it was so believable. Damn. And I would have gotten away with it too if it weren't for you meddling kids. But in all seriousness, even from my retelling of the documentary, you can see what I said from my previous video to be true, right? Within the forgery portion of his crime, yet it's wrong how it's framed, you are kind of rooting for Mark on sticking it to the government and church and getting one over on them with these fake documents. In this day of eat the rich and take from these corporations and establishments before they take from you, you kind of see that part of his crime as not so shameful, and Mark is more of a Robin Hood in his own selfish, narcissistic kind of way. After Mark was caught of being an A-class forger that essentially stole millions from wealthy people and establishments, it was time to find his motive for the bombings and the reason for the killings of Stephen Fred Christensen and Kathy Sheets. With Mark Hofmann, though, I am not the one to judge on how people naturally speak. You have to hear his live interviews on this documentary series. He sounds like a stereotypical identifying woman. From what he looks like to how he sounds during his interrogations is stark and a contrast. I will see if I can put a clip of him speaking just so you all can hear what I hear. If it's not uploaded, that means it was copyrighted and I had to take it off. On January 23, 1987, a plea bargain allowed Mark Hofmann to plead guilty to less serious charges and avoid a jury trial and bypass any chance of receiving a death penalty. He pleaded guilty for forgery and murder. He admitted to forging 2 documents that dealt with the founding of the Mormon Church and admitted to killing Stephen and Kathy with pipe bombs to escape detection. All in all, he agreed to 4 guilty pleas, and Mark was sentenced to 5 years to life in prison. From Mark Hofmann's interrogation, he bought the materials of the bombs a week or 2 before the 2 bombings. He came to the conclusion of creating and using bombs to kill the same day he made the purchase. Mark was having serious money issues because not only was he living a high-expense lifestyle, he was also living a high-risk lifestyle from all the personal trips and selfish splurges he gave himself. Mark was juggling forgeries and exchanges that, with his lifestyle, was too much occurring at once for him. Mark felt that the bombings were his way of not getting caught from his new forgeries, the McClellan Collection, in which he lied and manipulated Rust Coin and gift shop owner Al Rust to be lent money from. Al Rust was a business partner in this McClellan Collection, yet not even he saw the collection. The Salamander letters were sold to Stephen Christensen for $40,000 originally. So of course Stephen wanted dibs on this new McClellan Collection Mark was offering, as in hopes of obtaining the documents for the Mormon Church. The collection definitely would be worth $10 to $20 million back in 1985, so who knows the extreme price it would go for today. This McClellan Collection would have saved Mark from his debts and owings. With that, the loan Al Rust gave to Hofmann, and Hofmann taking ages to produce this authentic collection, Mark felt the pressure and it was getting too intense, and he didn't believe he could produce this 116-page forged McClellan Collection in time. Hofmann was getting pressured by Stephen Christensen and Al Rust to produce the documents, and since he couldn't handle the expectations and didn't want to get found out as a liar, he decided to plan the bombings. Stephen Christensen was supposed to meet with Mark the week of the bombings and collect the McClellan Collection from him. But since Mark knew that he had nothing to give, he orchestrated the bombings. And for Mark's suicide bomb in his car, he placed the portion of the McClellan Collection that he completed in the trunk. And then, with a bomb going off, anyone wondering about the collection would assume most of it was destroyed by the bomb, and therefore the complete 116 pages would never be able to be accounted for. That was a decent plan, and Mark would have been in the clear if it wasn't for the unaccounted witnesses and sloppy invoices he didn't consider would turn up. Stephen and later Kathy Sheets were bombed and killed instantly because Mark felt that Stephen and Kathy's husband Gary would find out about the truth of the McClellan Collection. Therefore, he placed bombs, one with Stephen's name on it, and one for whoever was at Kathy Sheets' home. An end-all be-all, luckily justice was served, and Mark Hofmann remains in Utah State Prison to this day. On the last episode of this chapter, it shows Mark's childhood and reenactments of events when he was younger. Ex-friend Shannon Flynn and ex-wife Dory Hofmann discuss Mark in a humanizing way as they knew him. It must have been hard for them to come to terms that he was a psycho and that they were both fooled and manipulated by their love for him. My biggest gripe on this 3-part documentary, Murder Among the Mormons, is that we see with the editing and all the martyr factor. Meaning you see the reasons Mark Hofmann did the things he did and why, and also what early influences maybe contributed to why he ended up killing 2 people and becoming a world-class forger. It just feels too humane for a person that literally ruined countless people's lives and made a lot of them question their faith. So with that, I finished this video, and thank you so much for watching Chapter 1 Part 2 of It Girl in Crime, Murder, and Mystery. This has been an interesting ride, my second video ever. The first video was definitely a learning experience, and so is this, so thanks for the feedback too. I hope with the second video you see improvements, and now sound off in the comments if you agree with me on my martyr theory with this documentary on the Utah bombings, or if not, tell me why. Subscribe, like, and follow on all platforms linked in the description below. See y'all next week for Chapter 2 Part 1 when we discuss the It Girl topic of murder. Bye!